Hi, and welcome back to the intermediate chess course. I'm going to start today by telling you about an adage, an old chess adage, which is it's kind of like a phrase which has been passed down from generation to generation of chess players. Now, the phrase, the adage, is chess is 90% tactics. Now, do you think you agree with that? I spoke to a really strong player at my club, Epsom Chess Club, and he reckons that that's probably true. You'll see the more you play that actually what decides the game, what decides who wins, who loses, or whether it's a draw, is often based around tactics. So again, those four crucial ideas, the fork, the pin, the skewer, and the discovered attack. So I think, again, we'll start off with a puzzle so I can demonstrate one of these again. Okay, this is from Black's point of view, and I'm going to show you a move by White. And we're going to try and find a way out of this situation that's been created. Now, White does this move. Rook from d1 to d7. So we're going to have to identify this first of all. What has White done? Well, he's done a fork. Well, two bishops, which seems a bit unfortunate. I mean, this bishop in particular, it would be quite a shame to lose it, you would imagine, because it's in such a good position. Look, and it's cutting through the entire board, all the way down to to White's king. Notice the king can't move as a result of that. It's a great shame that we'd have to lose this magnificent piece. But often with forks, we have to find a way of creating a bigger threat in order to stop the opponent from taking one of our pieces. So pause the video, maybe set this position up on your board, and see if you can work out a way of creating a bigger threat than what White is doing. White is threatening to take a piece worth 3 points. So can we create a bigger threat? Pause the video. Okay, well done if you spotted this move, which I'm about to show you. We're actually going to do this, bishop to f6. If you didn't spot that, don't worry. Maybe you can tell me now why that move was played. What would happen if, if White did this move? Rook takes bishop. I'm going to show you that now. Rook takes bishop. Well, in response to White's fork, we can do a pin. Bishop to d4, pinning the White queen to the king. When we do a fork against the king and queen, we call it a royal fork or a family fork. I don't think there's really a name for this, but we can call it a royal pin, if you like, this situation. A much more sensible move for White in this situation may well have been just to cover the d4 square using this knight, for example. But then that would have allowed us an extra move, and we could then have probably moved the bishop somewhere, I guess here, something like that. Notice that would be safe because we're protecting our other bishops, so there's no chance of a fork like that. Lots of arrows, but hopefully you followed all that. So the idea is bishop to d4. So well done if you spotted that. Okay, I want to show you this. Now, you might wonder, why am I showing you this strange position, and what's it got to do with what am I learning? Well, basically, king and rook against king and rook is going to be a draw. Okay, unless one player makes a serious mistake and puts their rook in danger, or, I don't know, runs to the corner and gets checkmated. I mean, that's very unlikely. But the question is, why is this a draw? Well, imagine we're playing black here, okay? Think about what you would do in this situation. I know it's very unlikely, but what would you do? Well, I guess the way of proving that it's a draw is, I think you can do it in one of two ways. Either we adopt a sort of an aggressive strategy and we just simply come down here and we start checking the enemy king. So wherever it goes, we just check it, check, check. Even if it hides, we can start going down here, and then, well, then it's probably white's turn to check. So white will keep on checking, check, and then, okay, well, white can't check anymore. So, okay, so now it's black's turn to check. So this kind of thing, it goes around in circles, because all we're doing is we're attacking the enemy king. And this is a very good defensive technique in an endgame. If you find that you're trying to defend a position, maybe you're a pawn down or something, or you want to try to maximize your resources, you can simply keep checking the enemy king. And that's a good way of trying to draw the game often. Because if the king, in particular, if the king is stuck, it's not in a good position, then you can attack it. And you can either, you may get lucky even and be able to force a checkmate. But the position of the king in the endgame is very significant, because it can decide the result of the game. Even if you're several points down, you may find that if the enemy king is stuck in the corner and yours is far more active, then you can actually use that to your advantage. Now, I've just shown you one way of proving this is a draw, simply by checking. There might be another option, and it is what's called restraint. Now, restraint is proving basically that that white needs both his pieces, or both their pieces, to win this game. White can't checkmate with just the rook by itself. So what we can do is just trap the enemy king against the wall, and prove that that he can't move off the back. So even if white tries to jump across here and attack, we can just swing across the other side of the board, and we have nothing to worry about. We can just keep the king there. If let's say that we did this, if white tried to attack us, well, that's not a problem either. We can just prove that we can just attack the rook like this. So essentially, there are two ways of getting a draw here. Number one is by checking the enemy king, like this. Number two is by restraining the enemy king. So the king is always the target here, okay? I'm going to show you, therefore, a more complicated position, slightly more complicated. Again, I think this is probably a good position for you to set up on your board. So pause the video if you need to do that now. The situation that we have is, it looks quite difficult for black. Notice that this pawn is going towards the end. Okay, so this pawn is one step potentially away from turning into a queen. But luckily for black, there is a resource that we can use to kind of draw this game. Okay, and by a draw I mean sort of prove that white can't really make any progress. Now, obviously, this is something that you get to practice a lot more. If you play a play against a player who's quite a similar standard, then you'll find that your games often lead to an end game, because you're so well matched, and it's unlikely that the game will be decided earlier than that. This is why strong players, very strong players, they end up playing a lot of end games, because neither player makes a serious mistake in either the opening or the middle game. So therefore, the game goes to the end game, and often the game's decided in a more, I suppose, with fewer pieces on the board. So in this position, first of all, we have a tactic. And I wonder if you can spot this tactic. Pause the video. Okay, so it's going to be one of those four things, isn't it? It's going to be either a pin, a fork, skewer, or a discovered attack. In this situation, it is a skewer. Rook to h2. Now notice it's check. So white has to move the king. There's no way of blocking, no way of taking the rook. So I suppose chances are they're going to move the king up like this. And that means we can pick off this pawn. Now, this is very important because if white had, for example, instead of attacking the king, if they'd have done this move, then notice that white could have moved the rook from behind the pawn. And even if we'd have taken this, there would have been an opportunity for white to move this pawn down. Okay, and then we would probably have to swap the rook for the pawn. Again, if you need to play that on your board, that's fine. But we need to avoid this because it would be too late. It would be too late in attacking this pawn here. So we need to do a little tactic first in order to gain a move. It's called that word that I can hardly ever pronounce, Zwischenschach, the in-between check, in order to gain this a move. And so now we're attacking this pawn. So I guess you can probably see if white moved this rook, let's say they moved it there, then that would undefend this pawn and we would just take it. Okay, so that means that white cannot move the rook. If they move the rook, they lose the pawn, and it's most likely going to be a draw because we have 3 against 3 and rook against rook. Okay, so therefore white tries to move the king. So all we have to do now is go back to what we were thinking before. How do we get a draw in a rook endgame? Well, either we use restraint, so either we play a move such as perhaps rook here to restrain the king, stop it from coming any further, or we adopt a more aggressive strategy. I'm just going to delete that move. We adopt a more aggressive strategy, which is maybe just by checking the king. So even if the king marches closer to this pawn, we're not really able, well, not actually, this would be perhaps a little mistake, I think, because after this move, white can approach the rook, and it forces the rook to move, so we move it away, and then notice that the king can protect this. I think it's not worth the risk allowing the king to reach there and allowing the rook to move. Now, it's possible we can keep on checking the king, but a better move might be, in this situation, might be to move the rook back to a1. Okay. Notice that if we moved it somewhere like to here, and we were thinking, well, maybe we can get hold of some pawns, that's probably not quite the right idea at the moment, because that means that white gets an extra move. So if we try and take this pawn, okay, well, perhaps the king can approach, and if we then come across to take the pawn, then white can move the rook out from behind the pawn and then push the pawn on. What we have to do is stay in touch with this pawn. We have to threaten it in order that white doesn't move the rook out the way. Okay, so rook a1 is the move. So even if white tries to approach this pawn, what we can do is, well, we do the same thing as what we did before. We attack the enemy king. Check, check, check. We may end up in a repetition. It's possible that the same position could occur 3 times, and that would be a draw as well. So that's not really what white wants. White's trying to win the game with the extra pawn. So even then, I suppose white would have to probably just retreat the king like this. But even when he or they get back to that situation, well, all we have to do is run back to a1 again. So we're back defending this pawn. Now, what would happen, do you think, if we, instead of moving the rook, what would happen if we moved the king? This is an interesting situation, I think, because it's possible that you might think, well, we don't really want to move the rook. How about if we move the king? Let's say we move the king to this square. What would you play as white? Remember that the pawn is going down here. I'm going to switch the board round actually, so you can probably see it a little better like this. So what would you play here as white? I think there's a really good move, and it's this one. Rook across to h8, a zwischen Schach, the in-between check. So notice now that the rook is no longer blocking the pawn. So even if the king moves back, we can do this move. We can promote our pawn. Notice the queen and the rook are protecting each other. That's very important. So that if rook takes rook, rook takes rook, and we're a whole rook ahead, and we should win that game easily, okay, by bringing the king in and then gradually squeezing black's king away from the pawns and then taking the pawns later, okay? So we cannot do the move king to h6. The same thing if we do king to f6. The rook comes here and then the pawn comes up. Notice that the check, the zwischen Schach, is crucial here, okay? So king f6 and king h6, these are both bad moves, blunders. There's one other possibility. What happens if black plays king to f7 with the idea of perhaps of approaching this pawn? There's actually a very clever trick here. It involves one of those tactics I told you about, one of those 4 possibilities. Pause the video, see if you can see it. Well done if you spotted this. The answer is rook to h8. You might think, well, why? Well, obviously, if the king approaches, then we just push the pawn up. But more likely, the rook will take the pawn, but then we have a nice little skewer. Rook there, skewering the king to the rook. So that is also going to be game over. I'll just quickly show you an alternative. I think these 3 moves we know are losing. Those all lose. There's a possibility that king h7 would also be okay. That would probably be okay. But the most simple way to draw this game is by either creating a blockade, a restraint, or by checking the enemy king, but ensuring that if we're not checking it, we remain in contact with this pawn. Okay? I'm going to unshare my screen now and say thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Remember, chess is 90% tactics. So if you spot a tactic, see if you can get it to work. Thanks for watching and see you next time.